All right. So one of the nice things and casual things is with our timing that we had a lovely coffee break. Let's get back together and go to the next part of our conversations. And I want to say, of course, I'm really appreciate that we had the university leadership with us this morning. It means a lot to us as faculty, as students, that they support these initiatives. And of course, just want to say a personal thank you, Consul Gill, and also Mrs. Bruiser, for your great organization and help with putting this all together, not only with money, but also with all the other support that you were giving. And so throughout this conference, we will discuss that we are living in rather different administrative and planning systems. That actually, in fact, has been a thing when I came to Rutgers in 2006, right, from the Technical University of Munich, with my personal focus on post-industrial landscapes. That's actually why I found New Jersey so interesting, because there is a number of those, and I got to love actually New Jersey almost as much as I love the rural region. But when I came here, I realized some of my colleagues were saying, oh, you can't do that. This doesn't work. You cannot do this. And so I realized, yes, we cannot do things here that I'm used to. Another way around, you cannot do things in Germany that I thought would be helpful, because we are thinking in different ways and we have different approaches. And some of the cultural roots of how we perceive land, how we perceive space, how we perceive community, these are elements that also guide our planning and policy decisions. And so looking into those will help us to understand some of the differences. However, this introductory talk this morning is about to share some of impressions of my kind of personal impressions for me from the rural region and from New Jersey, and why I think it's a good case study and example to compare. Then after that, Tony Broccoli, colleague from the Department of Environmental Sciences, will highlight some climate changing facts, like put us to the, what actually are the signs, right? And that's what you are representing, and that's what we're doing. And then Robin Lerchenko from the Department of Geography will introduce the theme of people and climate change, and actually relate to some of your research that you've done in this field, and not only that people are impacted by climate change, but how and who are the groups, and how are we actually making this, for many people, it's just a very personal thing. And so you will talk about that interaction. And then there will be Richard Alomar, the chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture, who will share some thoughts about how does climate change actually impact specific places, locations. We in landscape architecture are designing places. And so how does that change, and how does that relate to the challenges of climate change? And then the fourth speaker will be Clint Andrews from the School of Planning and Public Policy. And I think if we have one wizard of knowing how planning in New Jersey works in the whole context, I think, Clint, that's very much you. And also about how these new challenges are actually questioning our ways of doing. We may have to look into new ways of doing, and Clint will give us an introduction into impacts of policy and planning. An overall discussion to all those conversations, we have it around 11:25, which would be 17:25 in Germany. And folks in the room, for that discussion that we have just before lunch, you are very much welcome. We will probably share one of our microphones here with you. It's like the room is not too big that we can speak loud to each other, but that we understand, and that the people online will understand that, and also for the video and for the documentation of all these interesting thoughts. For the people on Zoom, please use the chat function. Like, this computer is up here because here we can read the chat, what is happening in chat, and so we can actually introduce those. I will moderate that final discussion so we can introduce those questions here. So, New Jersey and the rural region. Both regions have a pretty bad image. When I told my mother that I was bringing Rutgers students to Germany and bringing them to the rural region, she did not approve. She would say, why shouldn't I show rather nicer parts of Germany, like the castles and the beautiful river and all these nice things? and not that dirty and ugly industry. However, New Jersey is not much better off. For New Yorkers, we are the bridge and tunnel people, and TV shows like The Sopranos or The Jersey Shore are playing off that same theme. And I have to say, when Geza and I went out, when we moved in our first America trip on a vacation, and we happily, I just moved to America and so great that we're here. And we moved to New Jersey and I was so excited. And the other American on that location said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." So we are in the ultimate suburban state, and we're spending most of our time trapped in traffic. So, and that was actually since the early colonial days. Oh. Yes, since the early colonial days, New Jersey is tucked away between New York and Philadelphia. Our population density is actually comparable with the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, which is the 16 million people most populous state in Germany. North Rhine-Westphalia has a similar juxtaposition between urban and rural areas as New Jersey. A main difference is that Germany went through a period of municipal reforms when small towns were merged. This was actually like in the 1960s, 70s happening, when the number of small towns were just becoming larger units. Like the town where I grew up, they were kind of unhappy. They were suddenly like the part of this bigger unit, but it was helpful. New Jersey never did that. We still have 565 individual municipalities and with home rule. And home rule is actually more than that the municipal authority of planning. Home rule means you can really deal with everything. Like we in Highland Park have banned plastic bags. The town can say that. We can say when stores are open, Bergen County has blue laws that stores are closed on Sunday. So when I want to go to the IKEA in Bergen County, suddenly surprised it's closed because they can say it's closed. So the towns have a much, much stronger role, which of course makes regional collaboration pretty challenging. So our settlement patterns in New Jersey are, well, basically are linked to the car in these days. So after the very, very early displacement of the Native Americans, so New Jersey has this history that because of these two shores with the Delaware and the Hudson, it was very quickly colonized in a way. And so Native Americans were very closely pushed out. And the main industry, our main cities developed along waterways. And as with the industrial centers. Up to the first half of the 20th century, the Garden State had a very clear urban-rural divide, making the agricultural landscape a desirable destination for healthy rural living. And that's kind of the point why you move to suburbia. And actually places like Metuchen, they started, which is like down the road here. Metuchen started as a vacation home, like as a holiday home, summer homes of New Yorkers. And so we even had our first, and now for me interesting to learn, the first planned community in the United States, Louisville Park, was established here in New Jersey. So this anti-urban sentiment became the driver behind the explosion of suburbia post-World War II, which was made possible by the car. And so we ended up with these vast mansions that you only can manage with a car. There's no way other doing it. However, New Jersey was also the home of American industrial heritage. New Jersey's industrial heritage is rich, which is going back to the very, very early days of the nation. Just want to mention the Thomas Alva Edison Labs, just one example for the focus on research and product development. And at the end of the 19th century, New Jersey introduced a very liberal incorporation laws, which actually ran against the tide of, at that time, anti-monopoly measures in the rest of the country. The outcome was that New Jersey became the preferred place to charter corporations, which generated actually major revenue. This business-friendly environment, this political environment at the forefront of industrial globalization in the early 20th century. So we were so we all know this, the word of Trenton, like our state capital, Trenton makes the world takes. However, the downside of the rich industrial history is the high rate of contamination. Also, state and federal governments, and I see like one of our graduates working for the state government right now, they are doing a big effort for significant cleaning up efforts, which is one of the biggest issues, certainly in low income neighborhoods. In addition, the extreme income disparity, and it's like when you just compare those numbers, is for me still shocking, between the richest and poorest households. That adds to the challenge. And that is a thing where you can almost overlay the contamination map with an income map and a public health map. So there is a close link between those. In the beginning, I spoke about the bad image of the state. However, sometimes our really, really great cultural assets are often overlooked. Diversity is part of our tradition. And this is not only about food and rich mix of communities, of food, it is the rich mix of communities and individuals. And actually, Rutgers is also an example of celebrating diversity with our student body and our faculty. Most New Jerseyans, however, have in common that they are not city dwellers. And actually, with our class, our planning class right now here, we had this conversation about what you like about urban and you dislike urban, why you live in suburbia. So this is that was a perfect example again for our conversation. So this overall non-urban attitude, something that can also be found in the Ruhr region. But before I get into that, I guess that in this room, we all remember the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy. That's the lower picture, that's from Union Beach. And the upper image was taken when I was trying to get the work at the first day of the semester, because that's actually Route 18, which was just blocked. And we all remember that and how we had to switch back to online teaching. So the Ruhr region, it is a place that fascinated me since I actually graduated from college. That was my diploma thesis, was about the Ruhr region. I find it just super fascinating. It's situated in the west of Germany, making the industrial heart of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia. Just like New Jersey, numerous waves of immigration created a diverse population and also contributed to a very specific local regional identity because they were different than the rural identities around it. Overall, a no-nonsense culture of hard work and a non-urban, very much non-urban working class culture. This was not about the fancy cities of Düsseldorf or Cologne or all of this. This was the New Jersey, the rural region identity was strongly linked to work and was not about fancy, sophisticated stuff. The economic decline of the 1970s hit very hard. And actually, but politicians in the region consider themselves the Rust Belt of Germany. That's what we sometimes say. And so, for example, the city of Dortmund has a partnership with Pittsburgh because they share also these post-industrial conditions. However, when we consider regional planning approaches, we may want to actually look at the question of scale. So we see that the Ruhr region actually matches right there in North Jersey. That's exactly the same dimension. That's like county. It's literally the same space and the same population. So just to give us a relationship in scale. The region was named after the river Ruhr, where the first coal was found, because there the coal was very high on, like, just below the surface, or actually at the surface. At some point, there's a story that a shepherd would find and would start a fire and overnight, and then the next day the fire was still glowing because the soil was still. There's the Ruhr region coming. So the big cities in the south, like Duisburg, Essen, Bochum, and Dortmund, go back to the Middle Ages, like they're all firstly mentioned around 800 or 900, and go back to a trade route from the Middle Ages. And the area around there was rich soils that supported significant agriculture. The Emscher region, a little bit further north, was sparsely populated because a rather poor region with regular flooding and dominated by wetland, forest, and heathland. So think about, keep in mind that this was a wetland area, like fresh marshes, that kind of stuff. So with the energy source, coal and waterway access, the industrial revolution took off in the 19th century. Technical innovations like the seamless railway, wheel by Krupp, contribute to the success of the industry. However, a main difference to New Jersey is a single focus on large-scale coal and industry. When I said New Jersey factories, companies were much smaller in a way or in a different way, but here the rural region, the industrial production was on this very large scale of coal and steel, and also that relationship between workers and owners of the companies. So these large-scale industries, shown in gray, are linked above ground by railroads and canals. Below ground is an interconnected network of mining shafts and mining tunnels. This map is from the Rural Region Atlas, created by Christa Reichert when she was still at the planning school in Dortmund. And it is an amazing collection of documenting the rural region. So just keep in mind that image of the gray are the large-scale industries, the black, the railroads, and the waterways. So the settlement pattern, and my students will recognize that I love the figure ground, and I believe you can learn so much from it. Was not primarily an extension of the historic urban core, but followed the industrial pattern. While in New Jersey, that suburban sprawl filled farmland following the roads, like we all know that with the Highway Act and New Jersey exploded because suddenly everything was accessible. Here, the settlement was following the coal and the coal mines and the steel plants, and they were actually following the coal. While at the very south, the coal was right on the surface. As further north you go, it's kind of really going down that way. And it filled, so the northern coal mines were up to, so they followed the coal deposits. So in the south, these coal deposits were right at the surface, very close to the River Ruhr in the south. Therefore, the mines started in the south, and this is indicated, like the older mines are indicated by smaller symbols here. So and then over the time, the mines moved north and deeper and up to 1,500 meters or almost 5,000 feet deep. This is really, really deep. Think about a mine that goes that deep. Think about the water management you have to do. Think about how you provide the oxygen for the workers. So it's really a technical challenge. It was only possible that with the steam engine, you were able to pump out all this water. And so it started, you can imagine that this is a very sophisticated water regime. So the very last mine was closed in 2018, in December 2018. That was the mine Prosper Haniel, which finally ended the whole idea of coal. One important side effect of mining is subsidence. So when you dig out substantial amounts of rock and coal, then the layers of material above will subside. That causes damage on buildings. Second, it makes underground sewage pipes very, very difficult, or actually impossible, because they will crack. The subsidence in the rural region goes up to 30. When I found that number, I just couldn't believe it, but it's actually really, really dramatic. Not always that much, but it goes up to that difference. So, and so the solution was very you take the rural river as the fresh water supply to supply residents and industry with drinking water, and the rural reservoirs provide the needed water, but also are today a great attraction of recreational opportunities because you have really nice. The northern river became the open sewage canal. because of the subsidence, the river mouth had to move several, because of the subsidence, you couldn't do the sewage pipes. So which means you had to do an open canal that would allow you to control it all the time, and also to make sure that the water gets out and the sewage gets out. So because of the subsidence, they had to change the location of the river mouth for up to 4 times. So it doesn't really help that it's still the moving northward so that the river Emscher would actually reach the river Rhine while still flowing. However, it became so much the subsidence that now they have to do permanent pumping, and that pumping will be an infinity, and the term is a polder, which they do very much in Holland, but it's the same system. So you have to do a permanent pumping here. But Uli Petzel from the Emscher Genossenschaft will speak much more about it, because that's the organization that made this massive action. So the Ruhr reservoirs along in the south were adding to the quality of life. The open sewage in the northern part, not so much, the River Emscher. And actually it's a pretty dangerous, and when at some places it was pretty smelly, but now they have managed that it's not anymore there. So the post-industrial burden of the Ruhr region was, of course, very closely linked to the coal and steel industry, because to the decline of the coal and steel industry, which brought substantial economic disruptions. The loss of well-paying jobs, very much unionized, very much strong, secure jobs by the unions, a lot of them were lost. However, government subsidies helped to keep the unemployment rate mostly in check, but at the same time delayed the economic adjustments. One approach to transform the region from an industry-based economy to a knowledge-based economy was, for example, the establishment of higher education institutions like the Ruhr University in Bochum or the Technical University in Dortmund, where Thorsten Bichmann is here from. Both those institutions actually are part of the University Alliance Ruhr, which is a partner of Rutgers and an academic partner at this conference. A further and you cannot talk about the Ruhr region without speaking about the IBA. I think everybody in the German-speaking world, and probably most people in the planning world, will know that term. This was the most successful building exhibition. And it addressed, the goal was to address the post-industrial challenges through a architecture and design exhibition. Just take the most interesting projects, use and funnel government funding in a very smart way. This was not much extra funding, it was a very smart organization. Funnel government funding in a very smart way, and coordinate and make this a public event. So it was running from 1989 to 1999. With this initiative, Thomas Sieverts, one of these major leaders in this, made it possible to overcome regulatory hurdles and improve coordination between municipalities and substantially improve the region's image. So from a dirty region of decline to a place of innovative design and culture. And that was a great success of that. And the whole comment of post-industrial culture, that's what the Ruhr region right now stands for. And actually a leading project was the introduction of the new Emscher. Because when subsidence stopped with the end of mining, it was possible to build a below-ground sewage system, because when you have this open sewage canal, now you can build a below-ground sewage system, and the Emscher Genossenschaft is doing that and they give the number of 423 kilometers, which is long, right? It's like more than 300 miles. With that, the old concrete canal can be transformed in a new river system of a total length of 326 kilometers of renatured waterways. That is a significant action. So, and this new Emscher is the backbone of the open system for the Emscher Landscape Park, which is a sequence of open spaces that is built on historic elements of this region, but it's also very much integrating post-industrial landscapes. For example, that the spoil heaps that come from coal mining are shaping the landscapes, and land art installations like the tetraeder transform those into landmarks. So even after the EBA, cultural events keep the spirit going. It's a little bit like the walk to Rutgers Gardens on large scale, in a way, right? It's kind of the same thing. You do an event and you engage people and you try to keep the spirit going. And so, for example, the celebration of the city of Essen as the cultural landscape of, the cultural capital of Europe in the year 2000 was a major step in that. Actually, Sebastian Schlecht, who will represent the city of Essen in this conference, will talk more about it in panel 1, actually right after lunch. He will speak about it. So it is pretty obvious that the complex artificial water infrastructure of the rural region is facing massive challenges with climate change, and actually Uli Petzel will talk about that. So one additional component with the climate change is actually the more heavy the drier summer and the heat waves. And that image down there, the lower image is saying alle tot, all trees are dead. This is from the southern North Rhine-Westphalia, from the Siegerland, where the hot climate is putting the pine tree, the fir trees very much under stress. And this is causing problems for forestry because these stressed trees are an easy target for insects. My point is that these are diverse components of climate change. And on that note, I would like to invite my colleague, Tony Broccoli, to speak about the science base that we need. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My pleasure to be here this morning. Talk to you a little bit about a changing climate, and particularly some of the aspects of climate change that are relevant to the rural region and to New Jersey. So you may have seen some of these headlines recently. This is from the Washington Post. Intelligence study looking at over 100,000 papers, published papers about climate change impacts, and finding that a very large fraction of the world's people are being impacted by climate change already. And the regions that we're interested in today are no exception. The amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is rising. We've known this for quite a long time. These measurements from the Mauna Loa Observatory, pictured there, began a couple of years after I was born in the late 1950s. At that time, the concentrations were 315 parts per million. They've now risen to about 415 parts per million. And to me, it's very sobering to think that this dramatic change in the composition of the atmosphere has occurred during my lifetime. 30% increase in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And data from ice cores tell us that the carbon dioxide amount prior to the Industrial Revolution was about 270 to 280 parts per million. So the change that has resulted from industrial activity is even larger than what we see here. The atmospheric CO2 balance I like to think of as a little bit like a bathtub, where the carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere is like the water coming out of the faucet, and the natural processes that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere are like the water going down the drain. Right now, the faucet is turned up pretty high, so the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going up quite rapidly. But it's important to recognize that if you turn down the faucet quite a bit, but the removal of CO2, in this case, the amount of water going down the drain in this analogy is very slow, the bathtub will continue to fill up. And what this implies when we talk about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is that we have to reduce emissions very close to zero in order to stabilize the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that's a very tall order. Now, in response to the changes that have already taken place and are underway, global temperature has risen. It's risen a little bit more than 1 degree Celsius since the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th centuries. And most of that increase has happened since 1970. There, of course, are large fluctuations from year to year, but we're interested in the overall trend here. And as I stand here in the front of the room looking at the graph on the screen in the back with my not so great eyesight. Whoops. Let me go back there. That's what I see. I see a very steady trend over the past 50 years or so, since about 1970. And without reductions in the amount of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, this trend is expected to continue. So recently, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change produced its sixth assessment, and IPCC produces assessments about the physical science of climate change and also about impacts of climate change and also mitigation and adaptation to climate change. In this case, this is the physical science basis. I won't go through and try to read the quotes for you. You can read them yourself. But the point is that building on previous reports, the sixth assessment report points to significant impacts in a number of different areas. And it's some of those impacts that I want to say a little bit about today, because these impacts are important for the regions that we're talking about. So first of all, heat waves, unusual heat, extreme warmth, however you want to characterize it. This may be obvious that we would expect climate change, we call it global warming after all, to produce more heat, and we are seeing this. For example, these are data from our weather station at Rutgers Gardens here on the Rutgers campus, showing the average number of days of 90-degree Fahrenheit temperatures or higher each year, broken down by 5-year periods. So each bar represents the average number of days per year, 90 or higher, for each 5-year period. And we see that over the last 50 years or so, the number of days has approximately doubled. So we are seeing more heat. Thinking on a somewhat larger scale here, here's a map of the United States, and also thinking about even more extreme warmth, days of triple digits, 100 degrees Fahrenheit or more. This map shows that most of the United States, those days are relatively rare. The light peach color is areas that have less than 5 days a year in triple digits. Of course, we start to see more of them when we get into the southern plains, the Central Valley of California, and the most triple-digit days are in the desert Southwest and also in the lower Rio Grande Valley, where there can be as many as 50 or more triple-digit days per year. Under a high-emission scenario, one that we might associate with the continued dependence on fossil fuel energy without any way of capturing the carbon dioxide emissions, by the end of the century, the map would look something like this. So those areas receiving 50 or more triple-digit days expand to cover about 1/3 of the lower 48, and almost no part of the country is spared, except maybe the mountains, the Pacific Northwest, and northern New England from getting these triple-digit days. Here in New Jersey, we might go from having 1 or 2 per year at most to maybe having anywhere from 10 to 25 of these days. And extreme heat places stresses on infrastructure, it places stresses on people, and it places stresses on ecosystems. So this is a very important aspect of climate change throughout the middle latitudes, where this extreme heat can expand poleward. Now, in his introductory remarks, President Holloway mentioned some of the recent flooding events. This is from the remnants of Hurricane Ida here in New Jersey. And of course, something that not only was very damaging to property, but also led to significant loss of life people trapped in some cases in their cars and other cases in their homes, drowning as a result of this flooding. When we look at extreme precipitation days, and I won't spend too much time trying to describe exactly what the metric is in this chart, but we see that those extreme precipitation days have been increasing across the United States, particularly over the last 50 years, so that they're now happening about 50% more frequently than they happened in the first half of the 20th century. Here's a look at the aftermath of some of the flooding that hit parts of Germany and Belgium earlier this summer. An interesting study was published in the last couple months in which very detailed hydrological models of river systems in the headwaters of the Danube, the Main, and the Inn in Bavaria, in the southern part of Germany, were examined to see how climate change would affect flooding in this region. Now, before I hit the next button, I have to warn you that there's a lot of information that's packed into this next graph, as is common in these studies, but I'll walk through the important parts. So on the left-hand part of the graph, you see some blue box and whisker bars, and you see some orange ones. The blue ones are for precipitation. You can read that for yourself. The orange ones are labeled discharge, which is the term that hydrologists use for the amount of flow in a river. The x-axis of this diagram is labeled with return periods, you know, the proverbial 50-year flood, 100-year flood, etc. The y-axis is showing us changes. And there are no units here where you see 1, 2, 3. 1 means 100% more, 2, 200% more, etc. So the extreme precipitation events are becoming more frequent. That's why all of the blue bars are above the 0. For the flooding events, it's a more complicated picture. The more frequent but less extreme floods aren't changing very much and might even decrease in a warming climate. But the most extreme floods, shown by the bars to the right, will be happening more frequently. And this is a challenge that we have in trying to adapt with climate change, trying to live with the effects of climate change. Incidentally, over on the right-hand side, the information is presented in a slightly different way, but the important take-home message there is that even though these extreme events are going to become larger and more frequent, the average river flow is expected to decrease. That's one of the ironies of climate change. It means the heavy rains get heavier, but because in a warmer atmosphere, there's more evaporation, there'll be considerable drying in between these heavy rain events. And as Wolfram mentioned, with the dying trees, these flash droughts that can occur can be very damaging to ecosystems. Now, finally, I want to say a little bit about sea level rise. Sea level rise, of course, does not have immediate impacts on the Ruhr region, but it certainly does here in New Jersey. You're seeing a picture here of sunny day flooding in one of the communities on one of the New Jersey barrier islands, or actually in this case, it's a barrier peninsula. What's normally in the middle of this frame is a street, and you can see some people in their kayaks paddling down the street. Now, it is a sunny day, but actually there was a storm offshore that was enhancing the tides on this day. But even without storms, sunny day flooding, high tide flooding has been increasing dramatically in New Jersey. And those increases are expected to continue as sea level rises. But of course, the background rise in sea level is important because as sea level rises, some land becomes permanently inundated. But the big impacts of sea level rise happen during storm events. So here is an analysis using a tool that was developed by Climate Central, showing the effect of the combination of sort of the middle of the range sea level rise for the end of this century, about 4.5 feet, with the kind of storm surge, a 2-foot storm surge. 2-foot storm surge is not a big deal. Hurricane Sandy was 6 to 9 feet. 2-foot storm surge happens probably in many winters as a result of just strong winter storms, not hurricanes or anything like that. You see the red areas here as areas that would be flooded by this combination of sea level rise and storm surge. Most notable are the areas in the metropolitan New York City area that are affected. This isn't just something that affects the Jersey Shore. Certainly, there are big impacts along the Jersey Shore and also impacts along the Delaware Bay Shore and the Delaware Bay estuary, areas that people sometimes don't think as much about when they think about the impacts of sea level rise. So this is another aspect of climate change that will shape the future of New Jersey. So I'd like to finish up by just showing you where we are in terms of trying to meet some of the targets from the Paris Agreement. On the thermometer on the left, you can see where we are now, a warming of a little bit more than a degree relative to pre-industrial. The ideal target set by the Paris Agreement was 1.5 degrees, so we're not very far from that. And 2 degrees was maybe set as a more realistic target. Present policies aren't going to get us there. Even the pledges from the Paris Agreement aren't going to get us there. So more needs to be done in order to achieve these targets. And I might say that the targets are useful, just like a speed limit is useful on a highway. Just because you're obeying the speed limit, that doesn't mean nothing bad will happen. But the higher above the speed limit you're driving, the more risk there is. There will be risk associated even if we can stop at 2 degrees. And those are things that we're going to have to adapt to as we think about how the Ruhr and New Jersey evolve over the remainder of this century. So with that, I'll finish. I'll thank you for your time this morning, and I'll invite my colleague, Robin Lashenko, to come up and talk a little bit about climate change and people. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Getting my technical piece. All right, it's showing here, it's showing there. Is there anything else I need to do with the? Okay, awesome. My first hybrid conference presentation. So I'm here to talk a little bit about the people piece of climate change, the people theme of the conference. I think when we think about people, we often tend to think about other people. We often think climate change will affect other people. And even though we hear the data, climate change affects 85%, is already affecting the lives of 85% of the world's population, we still, I think, often push this question out and away from us. And it becomes very difficult to do that when we're experiencing extreme events, when campus is shutting down because a climate event or a weather event is, sort of literally in our face and in our lives. But I still think there's sometimes a tendency to distance ourselves and think about climate change. It's the future, it's someone else, it's somewhere else. And it's here, it's everywhere. It's a crisis of our lives today and a crisis right now. But it's also a very uneven crisis. It's a very uneven process, at least in the present. I mean, as we move into the future, we saw already maps where we're thinking, 2/3 of the country is going to experience extreme heat waves on a somewhat regular basis. But it's, globally, I think keeping in mind when we talk about people, and this is, I know, a theme of the conference, inequality and inequities. And I also just want to note that this is a map that just came out by a colleague of ours, from a German colleague of ours, and at the University of Stuttgart. It's a brand new paper, redoing, kind of re-estimating vulnerabilities by country and kind of nuancing it just a little bit more. But the big pattern is the same though. And I think the point about who are the biggest emitters and who are the most vulnerable, that question, we don't want to forget that question. That has to always be in the discussion whenever we're thinking about people. The uneven vulnerabilities of climate change, of course, aren't just at a country scale, though they're also at a regional scale. They're also inside our regions. Wolfram already pointed out the extreme inequality in New Jersey. These are actually maps of the New York region where I do more of my recent work has focused in New York. It's a small city that's very close to here, you know, our close neighbor. For those who aren't aware, that we're essentially a suburb of New York in some ways. Not maybe that's a controversial statement, but in any case, this was work that I was doing with the New York City panel on climate change and advising New York City about how to track social vulnerabilities and how to sort of those social vulnerabilities around climate change. And you know, one of the points here is that the social vulnerabilities around climate change very closely mirror all the other social inequalities that we have. So this is just an income inequality map. I could have showed an educational inequality map. I could have showed an English language uptake map. These are sort of part and parcel of these processes. These inequalities are, you know, deeply intertwined. But also, it's not just simply the impacts and the vulnerabilities where we have inequalities, but we also have very significant inequalities in capacity to adapt to climate change. So even those maps could have been adaptation maps that I showed and differences in adaptation, but I'm pulling these photos. We've already mentioned Hurricane Sandy, which happened in 2012 in the New Jersey, hit New Jersey. This was work that we were doing back in the post-Sandy piece and really trying to understand how places were adapting, how people were responding and adapting, and that inequality in what you can do. Do you have it? So you'll see what the house on the shot on the left, Union Beach, New Jersey. This was, you know, neighboring houses where both houses impacted. One neighbor is capable of actually raising the house up and, you know, getting themselves more prepared next time this type of event happens. Houses nearby houses didn't have that capacity. So that uneven capacity, it's across towns, it's within towns, it's across neighborhoods, it's within neighborhoods, it's within communities. The other photo is a different community in New Jersey that was in sort of a more interior community that was very hard hit by river flooding, and a buyout program was initiated. But even that, the uptake of the buyout program was uneven, whether they would buy the house out and essentially bulldoze the house, and the program's called Blue Acres, bulldoze the house and then sort of leave it in perpetuity, not to be developed. But that even, you know, sort of because, as Wolfram mentioned, our very kind of traditions of home rule, there isn't sort of a sense of everyone in the neighborhood needs to go. So those sort of, you know, those policy pieces, those inequalities are, you know, they're myriad and they're sort of diverse and they're complicated to deal with. A concept that I've used in my work is this idea of double exposure, so that when we think about vulnerabilities to climate change, we're always thinking about how those vulnerabilities overlay and interact with other processes creating inequalities, or other processes, other social and political processes that are creating pre-existing stresses, creating conditions of stress. And it doesn't have to be necessarily income inequality. It can be sort of political inequality. It can be even, you know, something like COVID is another way we can think about double exposure, where we're, you know, the disease patterns overlapping with patterns of income, overlapping with heat vulnerability. So sort of those, even like that would maybe even be a type of triple exposure. When we think about right now, one of the biggest topics, or the very, you know, sort of important topic that's being, you know, I think finally addressed in a much more rigorous way are the connections between climate change and climate vulnerability and structural racism, and identifying how historical patterns of structural racism in this country, in the United States, I don't know if there's a parallel in Germany, but I imagine there is, thinking about that connection with how those prior patterns set in place, for example, redlining of communities, set in place patterns where communities were much, you know, differently sort of positioned in terms of dealing with and sort of exposure to climate stresses positioned in places that were much more vulnerable to climate stresses, positioned with, places with heat vulnerabilities and so forth. And this was even being talked about with in sort of in terms of looking at the impacts of IDA and how communities that, kind of the historical context of communities that were most hard hit by IDA. In some cases, not all cases, because IDA certainly had some surprises, but there was still that kind of underlying pattern was present. And also in thinking about double exposure, some of the work that I've done in communities with environmental justice communities, again, this work is rooted in work that I've done with communities in New York, but the story I think is, very similar to communities in New Jersey, to communities in the rural region, which, Wolfram introduced so well, those industrial legacies. And many of these communities, these are 3 communities that we've worked with in New York, but, many other communities as well. The prior history of the industrial sort of pollution and, industrial activities that weren't done very carefully with respect to the environment. That's sort of coming home now in terms of new vulnerabilities to flooding, but those flooding vulnerabilities are overlapping with prior patterns of contamination, patterns of sort of, prior patterns in environmental justice concerns that are in place today. And this is, again, like some of the words from the communities that we worked with. These were 3 of the environmental justice groups that we worked with: UPROSE, We Act, and The Point. Their words about, sort of our environmental justice concerns, air pollution, industrial pollution, truck pollution, and so forth. Climate change is just one more thing that's exacerbating the stuff that we already are dealing with, that we're already fighting for. I also want to just make a point in terms of overlaps and double exposure. There's also, a big emerging concern around climate adaptation and whether climate adaptation actions may actually inadvertently contribute to displacement of residents who can no longer afford to live in communities that are climate protected. And so, sort of that sense of climate adaptation, or the term sometimes used, which the city of New York hates, is climate gentrification. I'm sure that's not it's not an appealing term, but it's sort of a term that is sort of, present, and it's certainly present in the discourse about what's happening with climate change. So I think I've been, a little bit sort of on my students call it the doom and gloom side. And I actually want to pivot a little bit and sort of, maybe try to be a little bit more positive and sort of point out that when we think about climate change and people, we also need to think about the hope, the things that can motivate action instead of sort of making people shrink down and hide and not want to engage with the problem. And so fighting climate change or addressing climate change also offers tremendous opportunities for building resiliency, for enhancing equity. And this is my PhD student Kai Wynn's PhD work is looking at, particularly at Sunset Park, Brooklyn, and looking at waterfront development and the interactions and potential positive interactions between building climate resilience and job creation. And that of course is, I need not say, it's a huge theme of the Green New Deal. It's a huge theme of the Build Back Better Infrastructure Act, which is being discussed right now. And I'm not going to go into any more policy because I know that's coming with Clint's talk in a couple minutes. But just those identifying those ways that addressing climate change can also contribute to equity, can contribute to cleaner air, can contribute to more positive neighborhood outcomes. I think that's to me an exciting, that's one of the most positive and hopeful things about the awareness of the climate crisis, is that it opens the possibility to actually take action that will really better all of our lives. I just wanted to flag a couple of reports. These are coming out of work by Rutgers researchers. The report on the left is some of the work that I've done at New York City, where we present an equity framework for looking at climate change adaptation and for sort of using climate change adaptation or sort of building equity into climate change adaptation actions. And then the report on the right is actually done by colleagues, Jeannie Herb and Lisa Amuller here at Rutgers. It's called the report's called A Seat at the Table, and it's also addressing sort of procedures and methods and sort of rigorous ways to ensure that equity and inclusion are built into climate adaptation planning. And so these are sort of, kind of more the on the ground, that when you're doing climate adaptation, when you're getting ready, how do you do it in ways that are equitable, respectful, inclusive, and so forth. Very critical issues for this. It's a very, very large issue, but doing it in a way that is equitable is sort of, to me, so tied into sustainability. And I just kind of want to end, I guess, my talk with that message, that just thinking about climate change as an opportunity for positive change and to create positive futures for everyone, for ourselves and for all other regions. Thank you. And I guess our next speaker is Richard. Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, there we go. That makes life a lot easier. So good morning, everyone. I'm Richard Alomar. I'm the chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture here at Rutgers. And before I start, I wanted to thank the organizers of this conference, because I know how much work it took to get us all here. So I'm very grateful and appreciative for that. To all the folks who showed up this morning, great crowd. Really, really good to see everyone here, and also all the folks who are joining us over Zoom. So I'm just going to talk briefly about sort of how to look at place from the perspective of a landscape architect and the importance of collaboration. So for most of our existence as a species, when rivers overflowed, wind blew our houses away, or an earthquake swallowed our village, bewildered and stunned, we mourned. Then we either rebuilt or moved to a new place where we hoped the powers of nature would be kinder. When we moved to our new landscape, it became a place where we attached and ascribed new meaning and hope, right? So today we know that changes in the landscape, a world that has gotten warmer, where the seas are rising, reflects our laws, policies, and action. So for us in the Department of Landscape Architecture as a department and as a faculty, we address not only landscape architecture, place, design as a much broader endeavor. To go about to decipher, understand, and approach climate change as one profession and one group is a daunting and almost impossible task. So we do need this collaboration. We do need to be interdisciplinary. We do need to be transdisciplinary. We do need to be understanding that to affect change, we need to all work together. So for us in the department, we've looked at a sort of vision that sort of encompasses this, a more just future that honors the ground we walk on and the people we walk with. So the idea of justice in the landscape, justice in place. My favorite definition from justice comes from Cornell West. Justice is what love looks like in public, right? When we talk about the ground, we talk about multiple grounds, multiple types of grounds. As a landscape architect, for me, ground may mean designed hardscape, plants, vegetation, things like that. For an ecologist and environmentalist, it means soils, geography, geology, topography, bathymetry, right? For the folks who deal in policy, it means laws, regulations, these invisible jurisdiction lines, borders, dashed lines, red lines, all these imaginary things that we put upon the ground that also exist and are at times as solid as the hard ground itself. And then the idea of people. And that's where things get difficult, right? Place is where the policy and the dream get together with the people, and that's where it all gets kind of resolved and worked out. And by people, we mean all people, right? Regardless of your economic income, your color, your race, your gender, right? the basic understanding that we all have the right to be here and we all should be here and we all have a voice in how this works out. So rather than looking at place as this sort of, like the first slide, this romantic idea of sitting on top of a cliff, watching the sun set as the wind sort of touches our skin and stuff like that. That's fine and dandy. Poetry is a wonderful thing and it's something necessary to make our lives richer. But place is also an indeterminate spot. Place is a possibility, right? And in our profession, you know, we are called to be leaders, right? We're called to leadership. But I'd like to propose that it may be a greater benefit to all if we just were good stewards, that we all just took care of what we needed to take care of. Because quite honestly, not everybody could be a leader because who would do the work, right? So, and just with those thoughts, as we go through the conference, think of place not so much as a physical object, but as a location where possibilities can happen, where we engage, where we talk, where we find solutions, temporary or long-term. And we really don't know that it's a place until we get to live in it and we get to act on it and we get to be a part of it. Okay. Thank you. So our next speaker is Clint.
Well, good morning, folks. And so what I would like to do is bring us to the point where we can start thinking about action. And one of the ways that we try to act, you know, as a collective is through public policy. And so I want to make sure that we are thinking about that type of action in a realistic way. Some of this is going to be a downer, frankly, but I think there is reason to hope and reason to be creative here. This isn't the only way we can act, of course. We also have our markets and our technological innovators, and we need to make sure that they're in the room when we go forward. In addition, we have society at large, the cultural levers that we could be pulling if we're willing. So consider this 1/3 of a call to action. Okay, so I'm going to start with some basic physics. And the most important of these is that the President of the United States does not get to pardon a turkey until the first Thanksgiving of their term. And so there's no picture of President Biden up here. But generally, we see governments around the world organized into an executive branch that carries out actions, a legislative branch that debates and tries to determine what's important enough to create public policies around, and a judicial branch which tends to be more reactive and that tries to adjudicate conflicts among the other branches. And so there's, in the US parlance, there's branches of government, and they each have very important roles in any kind of climate action. There's also different levels of government, and this is also true worldwide, although some of the details vary. But in both the United States and in Germany, we have a federal system, which means there's a national government that does a lot, and then there are state or provincial governments that also do a lot, and that the citizens have allocated sovereignty to each of them. And local governments are typically creatures of the states and provinces, and international agreements are creatures of all of those nations who are willing to sign on. And so you can get a sense of where the weak points are. International agreements are so dependent on that awful term, the coalitions of the willing, that actually is very apropos here. Local governments have a lot more staying power, partly because they own place. as the previous speaker mentioned. But also because there's just a lot of hysteresis in the system, a lot of path dependency. Once you get started in a direction, you keep going in that direction. If you look at the government of the United States, I didn't find a similar picture for Germany, but this one's enough to illustrate things. You know, here we have the three branches, and we have all of the line agencies. And then way down below, we have many more entities that don't quite fit into the usual framework. And in fact, that's where you'll find, for example, the United States Environmental Protection Agency. It's not a cabinet level position. It is an agency that was cobbled together from offices of various departments after a National Environmental Policy Act was put in place about 50 years ago. And so it's been struggling for this last half century to gain attention, to gain credibility, and to try to make environmental changes for the better. And it has succeeded in some ways, but not in all ways. If we think about climate change, this is more than just EPA. You know, in fact, you can look around the federal government and see agency after agency after agency that plays an absolutely essential role in any kind of future that we can envision that's going to address climate concerns. And that includes not only the executive branch, but also the legislative branch and the courts. They all have been playing roles, will continue to play roles. There is no real climate czar anywhere in the US context. If we think about this, not from an institutional perspective, but from a procedural perspective, the basic physics, the basic civics class, Tony's already done the basic physics, is going to help us realize that just because we think an issue is important doesn't mean that we see policy action. Because first, it's got to climb a systemic agenda. It's got to get into the newspapers and be discussed and raised as a real issue that is worth addressing and that can outcompete other issues for our attention. And then at some point, it needs to get onto institutional agendas and become the subject of congressional hearings and of legislation and of court cases and so forth. And just to remind us that this almost never happens quickly, the Washington Post headline that I'm showing here that has words that sound very much like today, you know, stormy tests for climate proposal, California wildfires. That's from a half dozen years ago. We are, you know, just now with a new president and a turn of, you know, some change in Congress, seeing congressional staff putting out a Solving the Climate Crisis report and calling it a crisis for the first time. There's also this idea that public policy making has stages. You know, we're going to go through formulating policies, legitimating them through votes, implementing them through the executive branch, evaluating whether they worked or not, and then terminating them or changing them. That is a vision of policy learning that I think is important for us. And it's not the typical way that public policy happens, unfortunately, but it is essential in the climate space to figure out what is working and to ensure that we are adapting our policies as we try to adapt our civilization. Now, one of the fun parts of anything political is that not everybody has the same opinion. Not everybody shares the same worldview. And in fact, you know, there's all these different taxonomies that we can talk about. I happen to like this one that talks about, well, there's a locus of value. You know, do you value people most, or do you value the ecosystem the most, or something somewhere in between? You know, is it you you and your family that's important, or is it all humans that are important? And each of us has slightly different views on this. There's also a locus of solutions, and this is often overlooked, but we tend to have a preference for decentralized solutions or centralized solutions. And some of the names that you could put in these different boxes, where would you put Edward Abbey or David Foreman? Well, you'd maybe say they're kind of biocentric and decentralized. Where would you put Garrett Hardin and his Tragedy of the Commons? You might put him in the individualistic and centralized category. And the point here really is that we shouldn't expect consensus instantly. We have different opinions, we have different very fundamental worldviews, and that means partly persuading people and partly working politically to build coalitions that can last. Okay, when we get to the world of policy design, there are many, many tools out there. It's useful to think about policies that are appropriate at different leverage points in the process of us living and producing carbon emissions and trying to get what we want economically and culturally as well without doing too much damage to the environment. And so as we start to think about the many different tools, should we be applying severance taxes to fossil fuels to try to keep them in the ground a little bit longer? Should we be doing appliance efficiency standards to try to make sure that we extract more value from every kilogram of carbon that ends up in the air? What should we be doing? And clearly, we want to find solutions that make sense together as a portfolio of actions and that are striking that balance of being efficient, not wasting society's resources, while also being equitable, being fairly distributed. This is an area where once you have done one type of policy analysis in one field, you start to come up with a similar set of tools that you'll consider applying as you look at new policy problems, consider new fields. And so in the environmental space, we always talk about regulations, incentives and disincentives, liability, in other words, holding individuals' responsibility for their actions. And a whole set of informational tools, information for firms, information for consumers, training for employees, all of those types of things. And then there are other things like voluntary agreements and plans that are really meant to help us form some sort of a shared vision, which is something that we lack in the climate space. And if we look across countries, this is somewhat stylized, but in the US case, we do a lot of regulating and we do a lot of relying on product tort liability. We don't do much planning and we don't do too much use of incentives and disincentives. Although if you start to dig around in our tax code, you realize that in fact, there are a lot of things that are hidden in there, which are strong incentives and disincentives, but they're unevenly applied. And so certain things get put in permanently and stay hidden. Fossil fuel incentives in the tax code are one example, and others are constantly sunsetted and need to be re-upped every 3 or 4 or 5 years, such as production tax credits for renewable energy. In the German case, and I present this knowing that there are people here who know much more about it than I, and so I'm hoping that when we get to the next sessions, you'll correct the misapprehensions that are here. But there is more of a tradition of both regulating and of using incentives and disincentives. Similar to the US context, there's quite a bit of effort to try to provide information so that people will make better decisions, both firms and others. And there's a little bit less use of certain issues, certain things like liability, tort liability. One of the structural things that's absolutely essential to understand about any environmental policy making, I think in both the United States and Germany, is the structure of government, which is a federal system. And in the US context, I won't speak about the origins of the German context because I don't know it, but in the US context, this was fiercely debated at the country's founding. I've got pictures of two of the protagonists in the debate. You know, one is signed all of his articles in the New York Gazette as Cato, and another was one of three who used the pseudonym Publius. And they argued about how strong should the central government be, what powers should be reserved for it, and what role should the states and localities play. And in the US context, we ended up with a Venn diagram that reserved certain powers for the federal government, you know, the right to establish international treaties, the right to wage war, the right to govern interstate commerce, and several other things. And there were several things that were reserved for the states, but most important was the clause that said, whatever the federal government doesn't claim, the states can get. And then there were plenty of areas of overlap where it seems like we've given both levels of government important responsibilities. And this is where we spend all of our time arguing and litigating and legislating. And so what that means is that the ideal version of federalism, the layer cake where the responsibilities are clearly defined and you know which side of the chocolate cream you're on, ends up in reality being a marble cake, all mixed up. And that allows lots of mischief to happen, lots of ways to subvert public policy, to slow public policy, but also to do things that might take a long time to achieve national consensus. We can still do some things locally as a result. And so, in other words, there's a lot of interesting political dynamics that come along with the federal system. There's going to be local advocates and opposition to any particular action. There's going to be national level advocates and opposition to any action. If people fail to have their way at the national level, they will work at the local level and vice versa. And so this is a very dynamic type of system, and people are always changing their strategies. A quick example. Here's a picture of solar photovoltaics, the basics of the market. So the deployments from the year, for the last decade, basically, year by year. And so every year we've been adding more, although there was a big increase in 2016, then a drop off for a couple of years, but now we're back. And then in kind of yellow, a little bit difficult to see, is the unit price of photovoltaics, dollars per kilowatt hour. And that's been dropping, although it's dropped quickly at the beginning of the decade and slowed down for the last half of the decade. Now, in parallel with our efforts to try to grow this from a niche market into a mainstream important part of the energy pie, we've seen important federal action. And I highlight here about a half dozen of those actions spanning the decade. And so in the mid-2000s, we saw the creation of an investment tax credit for solar photovoltaics. And that was a short-term thing, and it needed to be extended. So in 2007, it was extended. And then in 2008, was it extended again, and also enhanced, expanded. And then in 2015, it had to be extended yet again. And so we've been seeing this consistent willingness on the part of the US Congress to create and then extend this incentive for clean energy. 2017, suddenly there's a different president who discovers a cool new tool that he really likes to use, and that's called imposition of tariffs. Because in the US context, many solar panels come from China. And so by 2018, after a year of wrangling, there was a 30% tariff imposed on solar. This is the same solar that we are extending investment tax credits for in another part of our government. This year, we are getting ready. Maybe we'll have some sort of climate action as part of the two big bills that are before Congress currently. It's not clear exactly what they will contain. Probably they will extend the investment tax credit. Maybe they will do something else. The tariffs have not been rolled back. And so what we're seeing is inconsistency at the federal level. One part of the federal government is pointing this direction, another part is pointing in that direction. That's not unusual. It's part of the nature of large entities that have many objectives. If we jump down to the state level, we see not inconsistency, but diversity. And so here's a map of which of the US states have renewable portfolio standards and other types of clean energy standards. And you can see just from the colors, without worrying too much about the details, that there are some states that are doing a lot and others that aren't doing much of anything at all. And that there's many flavors of these state level initiatives. And New Jersey is one of the states that is quite active and has both a renewable portfolio standard and clean energy standards and a few other things. And so it ends up with one of these map colors that all of my urban planning students hate, and that's when you have to put stripes on top of a state, a sign that it's doing all sorts of different things. But the point here is really, first, that the federal government and the state governments are doing different things, and that we have the laboratories of democracy playing out and helping us discover some useful clean energy policies. I want to now do a very quick tour in just these last few minutes of environmental policymaking to remind us of what goes on, because federalism continues not only from the federal to the state or provincial, but also to the local government, and there's an allocation of responsibilities. And the major theme in environmental policymaking in the US context has been decentralization. And so what we see is the federal government delegating lots of responsibilities to the states. They end up having flexibility in how they implement the laws. It's premised on this theory that localized units know best what the locality needs. That's often true in climate policy. It's problematic because we all are contributing our carbon emissions. And so if one locality doesn't care about them, that's a problem for everyone else. And these policies have developed over the last 75 years. And it consistently started with very localized things around water pollution and local air pollution. And it's slowly expanded to cover a broader range of things. But at this point, we see the states issuing, 90% of the environmental permits, performing 3/4 of the enforcement actions. So that, and yet it's somewhat of an unfunded mandate. The federal government only provides, a fifth of the funding for doing all of this. I know in one of the panels later on, we're going to have some current and former environmental policymakers who can talk about this and give you a richer sense of the story. if we look specifically at the different environmental compartments, in the land compartment, we see that the states in this country have so much power over land. They're the ones who make the decisions. What they don't do, they leave to local government that also has a huge amount of power. And this is, again, both power to try to prevent harm and power to do things positive and power to screw things up. 3 types of power here, right? If we move to the air compartment, and here I'm trying to tie it back to issues of planning and policy and the landscape, so I'm focusing on transportation, we see that the federal government provides powerful tools for influencing local policies, state and local policies, through things like the Clean Air Act, which call for state implementation improvement plans for air quality, and then funds for the last 30 years, metropolitan planning organizations that try to allocate the federal funds, and if they choose to, can use the Clean Air Act as leverage to try to improve environmental outcomes. And then finally, an awful lot of work happens locally, sometimes with state or federal support, but also funded by the local property tax base. And the water compartment, we see federal money helping with things like water treatment plants. We see the states doing planning and regulating, tracking all of the discharge permits, trying to enforce federal stormwater mandates. And we see the local level trying to deal with the land use implications. And they don't always align quite as nicely as they ought to. The waste compartment, here we see first the federal government backing out of things by, this was driven by the Supreme Court, the 1993 case that declared that waste is not garbage that we want to get rid of. Waste is a valuable commodity in interstate transport. And so that changed the way we can manage things, and it created this, it encouraged this vast amount of interstate flows of waste. New York depositing its garbage in Virginia, New Jersey depositing its garbage in Pennsylvania, those kinds of things. We again see that issues like a landfill have a lot of local ability to stop things, but we also see that there's quite a bit of power, as the plastic bag example that Wolfram mentioned. So to wrap up here, if we think about the US and German contexts, and here I'm focusing just on spatial planning, an area I know well, there are a lot of similarities, I think, the federal system of government that we share. There's differences as well. An important one is that there is no national planning legislation in the United States, whereas there is in Germany. We both value local autonomy quite a bit. We differ around some of the fiscal issues. In the US case, the local fiscal burden is really quite high, and governmental involvement in development is very low, and that contrasts with a more kind of middle of the road approach in Germany. But we end up with, in the US context, major themes of localism, protecting private property rights, and separating land uses, which used to be a good idea, but isn't so much anymore. And in Germany, a theme of decentralization and litigation and accountability. So to wrap this up, as we start thinking about how we're going to actually make a difference in the climate space in our two countries, I think we need to be realistic about expecting both variable and uneven pursuit of climate mitigation policies, and It'll be less so in the case of adaptation, but there the challenge is going to be to make sure that adaptation is fair. There's no reason for us to expect it to be fair based on several centuries of history that each of our countries can offer. So we have to do this consciously. And I think there's a need to really look closely at the intergovernmental incentives, the relations between the national and the state and the local governments around who pays for what and who does what, to ensure that we get sensible adaptation behavior. That's shorthand for saying, why is our national flood insurance program the way it is? But there are many other examples beyond that. And so to sum up, I think federal leadership is necessary but not sufficient, and a lot of this needs to play out locally and in close coordination with what citizens are talking about. So thanks for your time, and I guess we move to a panel now, is that right?
So thank you, Tony, so much for that very deep and thorough introduction into policy. And so right here we are. So the point is for this afternoon, we would like to go to the next, to the silver slide. Yes. Right. So thank you so much for this very, very insightful talks. This should kind of introduce our conversation, like much more, not just listening to talks, but having a conversation. And I would like to ask you guys one question first, and then very quickly go into to look into some online questions, and then discussions with the panel, with the audience. And here's the microphone, so that you please use that. What I found interesting about listening to you guys was the one thing is, Tony, you basically said, we know what you need to do. And Clint says, never believe that anybody's going to agree on anything, right? So there's our dilemma right there. And Robin, your term of climate gentrification was something that I thought, yes, of course. That's the thing that when the first time when we saw Union Beach, and how people were able to lift their homes and who wasn't to lift their homes, it almost makes you sad, because you really realize who's going to hit the next time. And then, and Richard, when you were talking about the ground we walk on and the people we walk with, is that what will Cello's guide? So my first question is then, how do we basically probably between Clint and Tony, how do you address that dilemma that, as the scientist tells you, that's what I would find, and how would you argue for it?
You want me to go? Okay, that's a great question. And what I'd call attention to are I remember at one point I showed a long list of policy tools that are available. And way down at the bottom was a tool called planning. And its purpose is not to tell people what to do, but to create a process where they're going to learn what's in their own interest. In that way, start to build a little bit more consensus that cuts across those disparate worldviews that I was saying exist out there. And it turns out, and for many specifics, there are things we can agree on, even if we hold different worldviews. We can still agree we don't want to drink dirty water. We don't want to have our basement flooded.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to frame things, because the science may be able to tell us what's likely to happen and what kinds of things could be done to prevent it from happening or to reduce the impacts. But ultimately, people have to work out, often weighing short-term inconvenience versus long-term gains, how they're going to address some of these issues. And, you know, as I sit here speaking through my mask, I'm thinking that climate change is not that different from the COVID pandemic in the sense that there are things we can do, but not everybody likes to do them. And with climate change, certainly we all benefit from the availability of energy and trying to find better ways of producing energy may have some short-term costs for long-term gains. We need some kind of process to work that out. Politics is part of that process. Maybe planning would better inform politics, which I guess is what I'm hearing from you, Clint.
I guess I could add a little bit to think about the other players in the room, the citizens, business corporations of all sizes who are increasingly finding that their logistics are being disrupted by climate change. We certainly are in a huge supply chain crisis right now in the business world, and climate change, the COVID crisis is sort of a preview of what climate change might look like for businesses, how businesses are starting to think about these issues. So again, I think it's sort of recognizing that it's in our long-term best interest. It's in everyone's best interest to address this issue. And I think it's just seeing, as Clint pointed out, that where's that point of engagement for your worldview or for your priorities? Where's that point of engagement that can, kind of make you see that the need for action?
I think, I agree that all those points are correct. And I also just wanted to point out that the world has always been messy and there's always been this dilemma. So it's not anything necessarily new. The only thing that changes is the topic, right? It used to be the plague, now it's coronavirus. So it all sort of moves in that direction. But I think one of the things that really struck me from this last interchange is the idea of engagement. The idea is that, there isn't a perfect solution, but that does not mean that we should not engage in trying to find a possibility, right? So we're all called to use our expertise, whatever that is, whether it's planning, environment, whether it's working with people, whether it's raking leaves, whether it's mowing lawn, whether it's cooking, whether it's helping out the poor. It doesn't really, we all have to do something, right, to move this sort of forward.
Right, and one thing I would like to add is when like who are the important players, is that in the German context, we do have the European level, right? And the European Union is something where it adds a lot to like things that we probably as Germans don't want to do, but the European Union tells us to do. And that has certainly on the environmental component, a good level for it. Richard, when you spoke also at the beginning, I was impressed when you said in early days of settlement that people would, like the home would be flushed away and you build up or you move to some other place. And it seems to be so difficult to move to another place right now. And maybe, so my question is a little bit, why is it so much more difficult today when we think about you have a problem and to solve it by moving away? Why is it so much more challenging?
Well, so it used to be that human settlement followed the migration of the animals that they were tracking and eating. So that you were obliged to move the way that nature sort of moved, right? If I want to move now, I have to think about, well, I got to sell my apartment. How's that going to happen, right? I got to talk to my wife. Oh, geez, that's not going to work, right? So, and just the idea, where would I go? What would I do? My family, So there are a lot more personal components. There are a lot of institutional components. There are a lot of barriers that impede that sort of, impede the movement. Possibility.
Yeah, I guess it's, the mobility piece with climate especially is really, it's really complicated because we do definitely hear a lot about climate migration or climate migration and this idea that people are being maybe pushed out of places that they really can't stay in, they can't grow food anymore, they're flooding all the time. But I think the reality is that migration is very difficult, and it's actually often a crisis of those who can't leave, who have to stay behind, who don't have that capacity to even, in, sort of very, very difficult situations, there just isn't enough resources to leave. And so I think it's really, it's again, it's a more complicated question around some of these topics.
Yeah, I was just going to add that one of the complexities is that people do become very attached to places.
Mhm.
And movement is possible, but that doesn't mean it's desirable on the individual level. And that's, I think, something that maybe explains why people in risky areas like along the Jersey Shore would rather put their houses up on stilts than move away.
And I guess I'd close with a comment that I don't think it's gotten harder. I think it's gotten easier as long as you have enough money.
Yeah. Right. So is there anybody, I'm looking at the moment, there's nobody on the chat that has a comment. Is there anybody in this room having a question or a comment? And I'm certainly looking at the juniors right over there, where that's our topic, right? And so welcoming, yes, why don't you come up and speak to the microphone right here and kind of say a little bit who you are, if you are with an institution or something, and just do that. And thank you for doing this little like exercise, getting to the thing.
Jog. Hello, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Sharonda Allen. I'm an educator. I'm representing my nonprofit Operation Grow Inc., where we work toward human, economic, social, and environmental sustainability. I'm also an Al Gore trained climate reality leader. I had to plug that. New Jersey chapter. If you young people want to join, please check us out. What I wanted to ask is that I know I always understand historically that Japan and Germany have been the leaders in engineering and architecture, and you build really great structures. In the United States, as you can see, our infrastructure is crumbling and we need help. And of course, this would help with climate. And I had a discussion with someone like, well, why didn't they pump the water out from these communities and these streets? I even asked that question about Katrina, and somebody said they can't do that, and we can. And I like the fact that you talked about the Ruhr region and the pumps that they use for those like mining areas. What kinds of programs or ideas do you all suggest to bring the United States up to speed when it comes to infrastructure, so that we're not sitting in water that could be pushed along quicker, or that we could, help the young people to build structures that are more sound?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. So I think that's a tough one.
I notice there's no engineers on this panel. I would add that in the US context, it's a matter of committing funds, prioritizing the shared infrastructure over the individual wealth accumulation of people. And we have been struggling for decades now to solve that problem. We do this in pulses in this country. I think we do almost a military campaign to build a national highway system, another one to create water treatment plants through an elaborate funding mechanism. And then we keep talking about needing to, whether it's a war on COVID or a war on climate change, I think, need to find a way to just do this on a regular basis and to, have enough trust in one another to allow continued investment in things that we obviously need.
One quick point that I'd like to make with regard to infrastructure is that climate change is rendering some of our infrastructure obsolete. Infrastructure that might otherwise have been fine for many decades may no longer be fine because we're seeing heavier rains, more extreme conditions. So that need is only becoming more urgent.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read all the details of the Build Back Better infrastructure plan that's actually sort of being very hotly debated right now. But it definitely incorporates some of what you mentioned around things like water supply resilience, community resilience. And but of course, then you sort of think about the political will and the political will to pass that bill and the political will to spend. And that's a challenge of our democracy. That's a real tough one to get through right now, I would say.
And I would also agree. I think we do have the engineering and scientific solutions. Because if you look at Rebuild by Design, all the sort of wonderful sort of proposals that came out after Superstorm Sandy, we have them there. But then, I love the marble cake thing. It still has to navigate through the marble cake, right? And that's a messy sort of process.
Right, actually, there comes in a question from the chat that kind of goes back to the whole moving thing. The chat, somebody called Carol asks, how about the current mass migration of refugees from Mexico and Haiti? If someone really needs to move, they will.
But let's hope we can move under better circumstances
Yes.
than an earthquake or illegal cartels and stuff like that.
Right. So the one thing is with the with the adaptation, the moving is in a way how supportive infrastructure, like an improved infrastructure, may help us to stay in place if we desire that place so much. But where do we see? Before I ask my question, is there any question in the room right now? Oh, there's another one. Yes, please. And that's actually City of Hoboken, I think, right? Just me. I apologize for placing it so far. What you may want to do, if you do have a question, you may already kind of migrate here in front and then kind of be right there. Just me.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all right? My name is Yasmin. I'm an environmental planner and project manager for the City of Hoboken, New Jersey. One of our panelists actually mentioned one of our projects, Rebuild by Design, which is actually starting to combine infrastructure with resiliency. And we have actually been progressing, and it actually, we were watching, now we watch during, Ida and other storms, is it working? And we do risk assessments and we start actually experimenting. And so I think of Hoboken now as like a laboratory, are our designs working? But my question to you all is really about collaboration. Even I feel like in the planning industry, in planning in general, I mean, there's transportation planning, there's environmental planning, and we don't talk to each other. And I think that, I forget the names of the panelists, but one of the panelists is from, speaking about public policy and politics, and another is speaking about science. And I just think that in my own career, my own professionalism, we don't really collaborate enough. And I just was wondering if you could speak to that.
I'd be happy to take that on, because that's one of the reasons why we have the Rutgers Climate Institute, which Robin and I co-direct. The objective of the Institute is to bring people together from different disciplines to try to work on these problems that can't be solved by a single discipline. So that is something that exists here in academia. Whether or not it exists sufficiently outside of universities is another question.
And one of the things that's come out of that collaboration has been, for the last 5 years now, we've been cross-training earth, ocean, and atmospheric scientists with civil engineers, geographers, and urban planners, so that your newly minted urban planner, for example, will feel comfortable talking about rates of sea level rise and understand what that means, and what we need to do now is increase the number of these folks by an order of magnitude or 3 to get the word further out.
Yeah, I agree a lot on the education piece around having people coming into the workforce, into the job world already having a comfort level with a business person speaking to a scientist and so forth. I think that's one of the really critical steps. But I also think sort of coming to the communities and working with the communities, and that's another thing that, you know, our institute has championed for, you know, more than a decade, is really that type of outreach, so that the scientist isn't sort of, you know, in the ivory tower talking out and saying this is what should happen, but actually engaging with communities to find out what do they need, what kind of information do they need to know, what kinds of climate concerns do they have, and how can we help address them. So I think it's definitely a communication piece as well.
And I think this conference in and of itself is a good example of how to bring people together to collaborate. You know, and just as a plug for our own department, we've decided to take on the issue of climate change for an entire semester over 3 studios, not only for us, but we're reaching out to everyone to come in and give lectures and talk, because again, the burden is too heavy for any one profession, any one person, any one jurisdiction, any one municipality. And, you know, even in the case of Hoboken, Rebuild by Design, that was an incredible collaboration between engineers, planners, landscape architects, politicians and stuff. The thing is, it never looks as nice as it does in the drawing, right?
If I can just break the pattern of each one of us getting one shot here, I just wanted to add one other thing. For the students that are here, you know, it may seem intimidating to think that in order to solve these problems, you have to know about all of these different disciplines. I think certainly it helps to know about more than just one discipline, but I think another important thing is to learn how to work in teams that involve people from different disciplines. Because let's face it, as hard as I try, I'm not going to know as much about economics as I do about climate science. But I can learn how to work with an economist. And I think that's part of the key here too.
Yes, please. One more question. Want to come up? And so if there's another question already in the room, as I said, migrate slowly. But we are patient enough. Thank you.
I'm Lauren O'Brien. I'm part of a campaign nationally for holding the fossil fuel industry accountable for costs related to climate change. And can't resist coming up here to ask, because we just mentioned economics. And my question is, hopefully in relation to the people conversation on climate change, is that we can't ignore that we're all paying for it. And that I'm very familiar with the Hoboken Rebuild by Design, and that was not free. Also pointing out that Hoboken was the first city to file a lawsuit against the fossil fuel industry to get some of those costs back. And there's going to be a hearing on October 28th for those CEOs who have known for 60 years exactly what they've been doing to the climate and lying to us about it. So my question for Rutgers, and I'm an alum of Rutgers, I'm very happy to be back after, I'm not going to say how many years, is will economics be part of the analysis? Because we have yet to see any kind of state assessment of costs or what it's really costing our taxpayers. There is now a municipal law for municipalities to put climate resilience into their master plan, which means vulnerability assessment. And I was thinking exactly the same thing about Hoboken. Now we get to see if it works. And certainly, you know, it was the first, and on Ida was the next day, it was the first anniversary of the lawsuit. And the mayor came out and talked about all the flooding that's still there. So the pit of money is endless and it all falls on us. And I'm just curious if at all with the analysis of climate change and the people, are we addressing, we talked about how those disadvantaged communities are hit over and over again. And this is another way that it's hit. So, you know, are economics part of the analysis?
The short answer is yes, they have been forever. One challenge is there's not enough one-handed economists, and so we end up with unclear policy guidance because the estimates tend to vary by orders of magnitude for the same damage measure. And that doesn't provide incontrovertible evidence that stands up in the sort of the court of public policy. And that is why I think the climate resilience element that is now required in New Jersey comprehensive plans provides a better way to get there, because it allows you to have that direct discussion about what is important to people in this town, without pretending to dress it up in science that isn't convincing enough. By science, I mean economic science. I think the climate science is actually clearer on what we need.
Yeah, although the climate science may not be as clear as some might think it is about events like Ida and to what extent the human impacts, specifically increased greenhouse gases, have contributed to that. This is an area that in climate science we call event attribution. And there have been great strides over the last 10 years in improving our ability to do this event attribution. But a typical event attribution result is to say that a particular thing that happened was made 3 times more likely by climate change. That's not the same as saying it wouldn't have happened, and so that climate change is solely responsible for it. So that's something else we have to deal with, that if we're trying to then take the next step and attribute responsibility, we're not necessarily attributing responsibility for the entire event.
Yeah, no, there's definitely, many studies trying to quantify the economic costs of climate change. The measure of the social cost of carbon is sort of a larger scale measure, but many studies looking on that at a community basis are looking at sort of the costs of climate impacts. But I think where the real challenge comes in, or one of the real challenges, is that when you start to project into the future, which I think is sort of a little bit connected to what Tony was saying, that you're in a range now where you're not just needing to a range of scenarios or a margin of uncertainty around the future climate, but now and then think about the margin of uncertainty around what the economy will look like in the future. So it's sort of overlapping and magnifying the kinds of uncertainties around future projections and around future costs. But so that's why we get orders of magnitude difference in those types of projections. But there's definitely no question that it's already been tremendously expensive just in terms of the human health cost of fossil fuel emissions. That's sometimes estimated into hundreds of billions of dollars. So it's certainly a very significant.
So thank you for the question. I think I'll be quite honest, for me at least, it's a very uncomfortable question, because it goes to the point of, the science and the economics and stuff, but it also goes to the issue of power. So who has the money and who's going to pay for it, and how am I going to get that money to do that? But also within this whole climate change discussion, in that toolbox, there are things like protest, activism, litigation. And that's also part of the instruments that we can use to affect this change. Because it's, from a landscape architecture perspective, it's not just about the pretty picture. It's about all these other things that we have to really affect change.
Actually, there's right now one more question coming up. And while you're coming up so there's also, if you combine this with a question from the chat where Mika Ketu is asking about emerging economies and going the same way of lower income groups, and how can we disseminate information on new technologies and on green infrastructure and renewable energy to underserved communities. That's one of the things I think we touched already on. A little bit of what I mentioned comes from the chat, but now go ahead.
My question is way less technical than that. So I recently read an article for class called The Adventure Gap, and it was talking about the racial disparities in enjoying outdoor activities. Part of the point was that if you get more people to care and enjoy nature, they'll advocate for it. So in your professional and personal lives, what is some tactics or strategies that you have found to get people to care about these issues? And that's what I'd like to.
Thank you.
I can start with that one. I think one of the I actually teach a course called Climate Change in Society, and we spend sort of the first sort of little chunk of the class, the beginning of the class, around thinking about, I begin sort of that, why does climate change matter to you? Thinking like you care about something because you recognize that you're connected to it, so thinking about where do you have a personal connection to the issue of climate change, and how, not just how does it affect you, but where can you engage with it? So we already had sort of a comment around sort of, you can, if you're interested in, sort of trees, and you can engage in, forest preservation. It's sort of, what's the little, so I go through and I ask the students, what do you do outside that you like? And sort of getting, I think, engaging with the things that people like, the things that bring them joy, and realizing that protecting the climate is something that sort of is joyful, I think to me is really critical for that establishing that emotional connection that gets people involved.
And I agree 100%. I think the issue of engagement, how do you engage with, again, going back to the point of, we all can't be leaders and we all can't lead the charge, but we can all be responsible citizens. We can all be stewards. We can all do that little bit. All of you as students have more knowledge now than you did yesterday about climate change, and you can bring that back to your household, right? To your brothers, your sisters, and your parents and your community, right? So that's also another way of engaging.
Yeah, prior to the pandemic, I would probably give, I don't know, 6 to 10 public talks a year about climate change. And I think the key is trying to make that personal connection. You don't always know what it's going to be when you're speaking to a group, but sometimes you can learn it when you speak to people one-on-one. What is it that they care about? Do they like to go cross-country skiing? Then maybe the connection to climate is obvious. There are other connections that are less obvious. But I think that emotional connection, it doesn't just have to be about climate change affecting them personally, even though most of us are being personally affected by climate change in one way or another. It could be climate change affecting something that they care about. It might be the polar bears for some people, although I would argue that probably for most people, there are other things they care about that don't seem so distant, that don't seem like they're 5,000 miles away. And it's always good to think about that.
And I'd just add that the thing that our little group has been focusing on is helping people appreciate that there's many impacts of climate change, that it's not just sea level rise. It's not just storm events. It's not just new mosquito species showing up here. There are enough impacts that you can find a point of intersection with anyone's life. And so we spend every summer working with one of the public housing communities up in North Jersey, in the city of Elizabeth, actually, where we do these, I guess we call them STEM workshops, but really they're grad students working with kids to do a project. And so this year it was measuring indoor air quality during heat waves in their own apartments and in their the apartments of the seniors who were living in the same housing complex, who were particularly vulnerable to heat stress and the associated impacts like that. There's a correlation with indoor air quality, negative indoor air quality. And they were doing fun things like measuring stuff and trying to think about how to communicate dirty air versus clean air, or a hot temperature versus a cool temperature. But they took that home and it was all about where they already live. And that was a form of engagement that felt natural and had immediate effect.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And particularly this, what is my personal level of engagement? is something that will probably guide our conversation for the next day and a half, as I very much enjoyed this introductory conversation that we had already, but there's more coming up and also more actively being engaged as in the further panels that are coming up. So you may want to check your app for about the 3 parallel panels that we will have this afternoon at 3. If you do not like it, look at tiny little screens. We also have the program printed out in front where you can actually check which of these 3 panels may interest you the most. For now, we will have plenty of lunch here in the back, and it's all very sustainable. And so please help yourself. You are very much welcome to probably take it and also go out and disseminate more. So we can actually eat under COVID conditions. So spread around and probably get a little bit of air or something for that moment. So on that note, I really, really appreciate your very inspiring talks, and thank you for your active conversation. And we'll see each other at the different panels at 1 p.m. Thank you so much.